appreciate your time, interest, and attendance. I look forward to hearing your thoughts, comments, and questions. Before I get started with today's talk, let me briefly introduce myself. I am an associate professor of history at Hope College in Michigan, and I teach and research in the areas of disability history, disability studies, the history of medicine, Japanese and Korean history, and world history. I identify myself as a sighted person, but I depend a lot on corrective lenses for my vision. I build my identity around sight, but also embrace the accommodations for my vision. Today, I hope to talk about some ideas from my book, Blind in Early Modern Japan, Disability, Medicine, and Identity, and also share with you some recent thoughts that have helped me reframe those ideas. This talk is adapted from previous presentations I gave and includes new materials from my recently published article on disability studies and disability history. I've had many interesting questions and conversations from what this book means to me to what others have found surprising for their own research and how aware I anticipate connections with new scholarship. Let me make a brief note here before I get started, and it is about language. This is something that I emphasize in my book. I use disability-first language to foreground blindness in the sources and in the lives of blind people. For accessibility reasons, I'll keep the original Japanese and Chinese references to a minimum, and I'll try my best to describe details in the visual images that I will show. As far as possible, I will use English translations and terms. I don't mean to suggest that the English words for disability map exactly onto the original words, but instead I hope to suggest that even where equivalence between languages can't be found, it's still possible to find common words for our interpretations of things. So what questions do we want to ask? We all have different backgrounds and probably understand disability quite differently. For those of us who address disability history, disability studies, or the history of medicine in our scholarship, what might be some questions that would cut across research or linguistic boundaries? What are some questions that might speak to an interdisciplinary audience? Among the three disciplines, the history of medicine is the most established. It has a long history that can be traced to the 19th century or before that time, depending on your timeline, including the professionalization of medicine through the 20th century to the present. Its agenda has changed a lot over time, of course, and the approaches to disease, illness, treatment, and health reflect the change. Disability studies grew out of the resistance to medical ideas of disability in the 1970s and 1980s, proposing theories of disability in literary studies, gender studies, race studies, and sociology. Disability studies brought together scholars and activists from different disciplines to combat the negative medical attitudes toward disability and the stereotypes that developed around disability. In this context, disability history, which is focused on social history, took shape. There are, I think, ideas about what disability is or should be. There are ideas also about how disability studies as a field tends to be too theoretical for most audiences, or too focused on the present or on activism as to miss the realities of the distant historical past that disability history captures. But I think we have an opportunity to find a common context for disability studies and disability history, and an opportunity to gain new perspectives by bringing the history of medicine into this common context. For me, disability history provides a new lens on how we reimagine the histories of societies and relationships. For my study and today's presentation, a disability history focus on blindness is a focus on disability, medicine, and identity. It broadens our understanding of early modern Japanese history. I would like to offer several keywords from disability studies to contemplate the points of interest for disability studies and disability history, and for the history of medicine as well. The first keyword that you see here is impairment. In fact, impairment and disability go together as a pair. This keyword, impairment, is a code word for impairment as a physical, biological, or biomedical condition against the social understanding of disability. The second keyword is embodiment. This keyword sums up the intimate relationship between body and mind, in that any impairment is part of an integrated system of physical, cognitive, and emotional experiences. What happens socially affects or can affect a person's experience of an impairment as a disability. The third keyword is intersection. This keyword builds on the two earlier keywords to argue for an interdisciplinary approach to disability through intersectional methods, as you can see on the screen, and to argue that various social factors intersect with one another in forming disability-based identity, which is one of many kinds of identities. This study, I hope, is a step toward a comparative global analysis of disability when we compare Japan to other societies. Let me talk a little bit more about why I wrote this book. I will focus on the what's and the how's on this slide. I wrote this book because I wanted to reconstruct the context of disability in a society, especially a society that is less represented in the literature in disability studies and disability history. So this is a point about how to talk or write about a society through a disability studies and disability history approach. The second motivation is to restore a semblance of life. For example, social norms, institutional authority, life with and without privileges or advantages. It speaks to the question of how we as historians use sources to find disability. The next motivation is to reposition our narrative viewpoint around this question: what did it mean to be blind in early modern Japan? And I think this question speaks to how we think about and rethink disability. So let me try to break down this question about what it meant to be blind in early modern Japan into two smaller questions. The first question is, how did specialists and everyday people understand medicine? The second question is, how did norms, authority, and culture affect blind people? In short, this is a book about questions and how I trace my way through the sources, get lost in the trail, and retrace my path to venture into new inquiries. There are 3 points that I wish to highlight in today's presentation. The first is about medical perspectives. Medical perspectives aren't everything, and I think disability studies and disability history have shown us why medical perspectives aren't everything. But we do need them in an inclusive approach. The second point is about words for disability, blindness, and blind people. There are words for disability and blindness in early modern Japanese sources, but there was no standard word for blind people, disability, or blindness. Blind people sometimes chose to include blindness in their identities. The next point, the third point, is about references. References to blind people are both explicit and implicit. And it does take some evidence-based reimagination and reading between the lines to figure out the details of the lives of blind people. So what did it mean to be blind in early modern Japan? Let me return to the original question. And here, let me try to re-articulate my original argument using the keywords that I shared with you. Blindness as disability was blindness as impairment, a medical impairment, an embodiment of experience, and also an intersection of factors that make up identity. The answer is complex, of course, and we can't reduce disability to just one meaning. But we have many meanings depending on the context that have to do with impairment, embodiment, and intersection. In terms of lived experience, blindness resulted in social, political, and economic disablement of blind people, but also in some instances, it resulted in enablement for certain kinds of work, particularly the entry into niche professions. And blindness also was the result of intersection. It shaped intersections, especially the intersections of factors that formed identity in early modern Japan. Before I go into detail, let me do a quick introduction of early modern Japan. This image on the screen comes from a folding screen art of the city of Edo. Edo, or Tokyo today, was the capital of the Tokugawa shogunate. The Tokugawa period conventionally started in 1600 or 1603 and ended in 1868. In the far right of this image here, in this final screen on the right, we see the Edo Castle, the residence of the shogun. Here we have the castle tower and then the inner sanctuary of the shogun. This was a large city, and it is a large city today too, as anyone who has traveled to Tokyo would know. Now, the Tokugawa regime was made up of more than 200 domains by some counts, and samurai lords ruled their domains under the shogunate, and these domains were known as can sometimes be called territorial political units of Tokugawa Japan. Let me talk a little bit about this image. The opening of Japan coincided with or was catalyzed by the arrival of American Commodore Matthew Perry and his ships in 1853. This image here is an artistic representation of one of the ships that arrived in Japan. And this was followed by unequal treaties, open ports, civil war, and the end of the Tokugawa regime, the rise of the Meiji regime in 1868, the transformation of Japan through new technologies from Europe and the United States. Now, I want to step away from this conventional story of remarkable national progress to talk about the granular yet significant details of the everyday experience of the Japanese population. And I do this by focusing on blindness. On this slide, there is an image of the Nihonbashi, literally the bridge of Japan. This place would have been familiar to many people living in Edo. This scene here is the first of 53 stations in a woodblock print series depicting the route leading from Edo to Kyoto, the imperial capital. Let me try to describe some details in this scene. It is early in the morning, and there's a hue of pink in the background. There is a procession of men crossing the bridge, and some men in the foreground right here with carrying poles loaded with goods. Let me show you a different rendition of this same image. How would we describe this image? It is blurred, the boundaries are fuzzy, yet we can still see colors. The colors are visible. Certainly, compared to the previous image, it is less clear than what we just saw. Now, what about this image? The colors are subdued. In the left frame, we kind of make out silhouettes of people, but in the right frame, it looks as if the image is filtered through a translucent white lens. I'm trying to say that when it comes to blindness, we have to speculate a bit. Our sources don't tell us how quote unquote blind a person was or what a blind person could see with visual impairment. Where descriptions of visual impairment, poor vision, and vision loss appear in the archives, we can only imagine what it felt like to be blind. There was a variety of conditions that would have made up blindness in one or both eyes. Hence, my working definition of blindness considers a range of possibilities. There was no one way to be blind in early modern Japan. Let's take a different view of Edo. So on the far right here, we see the same bridge, the Nihonbashi, the bridge of Japan. This image gives us a image. So I'm gonna exit here and reshare my screen. Hopefully this would resolve the problem. Great. So unless we know the social context, it may be hard to figure out that there's a blind person in this image. So let me zoom in onto the blind person right here. Let me draw your attention to this person. His head is shaven. He's walking with a staff. He has a cloth bag with something in it. Blindness was also a condition that animated the imagination by sighted people, such as artists, of what blind people look like or how they would be depicted in art. Here we see profiles of blind people as imagined and illustrated by prolific woodblock print artist Katsushika Hokusai. Hokusai is spelled Hokusai. We find profiles of blind men and blind women. They appear to be older people, and there are different expressions of blindness on their faces. We see right here a woman who has one eye that is shut, which may suggest blindness in that eye. We see a man right here at the top who has eyes, both eyes that are shut, which might suggest that he is blind in both eyes. And we also see a man right here with a scar above his left eye, which could suggest some kind of deformity that led to his blindness. Medicine and the everyday experience, I think, is part of this narrative. So let me introduce several questions to frame the next part of this presentation. What were some medical ideas about blindness? How was medical knowledge organized? How did people understand blindness? What were some cures for blindness? And this part about cures is less about efficacy. That is, it is less about whether they actually worked. And what do they tell us about the mindset of people at that time? I mentioned the history of medicine at the start of this presentation, so let me discuss some details to expand on the medical perspectives on blindness. This image on the right here shows the 5 spheres of the eyes. This comes from a medical text. The eyes on the screen here are outlined with clean 2-dimensional contours. There is no visual sense of the volume, but in the spaces inside the eyes and around them, we find markings. The eyes are divided into what medical scholars call the 5 spheres, with each sphere corresponding to a respective part of the human body. So let me just describe the spheres which are listed here on the left. The blood sphere corresponded with the heart, the wind sphere corresponded with the liver, the water sphere corresponded with the kidneys, the breath sphere with the lungs, and the flesh sphere with the stomach and spleen. Now, this was one model of human anatomy in Sino-Japanese medicine. Sino-Japanese is what traditional Japanese medicine is called even today due to the underlying Chinese medical thought. The idea is that health is a balance of forces, a balance of relationships between the eyes and the rest of the body. For example, when the heart is affected by disorder or disease, the signs show up in the blood sphere, the counterpart in the eyes. Disorder in the flow of qi, spelled as qi or ki in Japanese, or life force, was thought to affect vision, particularly in liver illnesses, because the eyes were thought to gain vision through blood flow from the liver. By looking into the eyes of the words for disability revolved around ideas of illness and disease. And in this medical context, the meanings of blindness implicated the health of the eyes and other parts of the body and the unique logic of blood flow or qi. This is another image, and this shows a different moment in Japanese medical history. It comes from a new treatise on human anatomy that was published in 1774 by Sugita Genpaku and several peers in his network. Sugita Genpaku is spelled Sugita Genpaku, and I'll refer to him as Genpaku throughout this presentation. Genpaku's vision of human anatomy, as seen here, is completely unrecognizable from the traditional Sino-Japanese perspective. The eyes are enveloped by layers of tissue, they have volume, they appear realistic, perhaps more artistically and anatomically realistic to us than the representations from the previous medical texts I showed. What was the context of Genpaku's discovery or the rediscovery of human anatomy? We'd have to take a detour back in time to the early years of the early modern regime, to the period of the early modern Japanese diplomacy. In the 1630s, the Japanese shogunate clamped down on the activities of Europeans in Japan, fearing that Christian Europeans and Japanese Christian converts could conspire to overthrow the government. As a result of the crackdown, only the Dutch of the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC, among the Europeans were permitted to conduct foreign relations with Japan, but they were restricted to an island outpost and placed under close surveillance outside of the port city of Nagasaki. For the shogunate, Dutch merchants and scholars opened a new window onto the wider world outside of Japan. Sources from Europe were scrutinized for Christian content, and those sources that passed inspection were allowed into Japan. From early on in Dutch-Japanese relations, Japanese scholars were curious about European languages, Dutch in particular, and they were curious about European science and technology. In fact, in the late 1600s, a branch of surgical learning traced to the Dutch and Europeans came to be known as the red-haired, quote-unquote, red-haired lineage, named after the visual appearance of their red or reddish hair. In the 1700s, the intellectual climate in Japan eased with books on European knowledge, with more books on European knowledge and more interest in examining them. Genpaku, whom I introduced earlier, was a scholar of Dutch studies as studies of European knowledge were known, and in particular, he was interested in Dutch-style medicine, a field of medical learning derived from Dutch studies. In his text, The Dawn of Dutch Studies, Genpaku recalls getting news of the dissection of an executed criminal to be conducted. Of course, he was not the first person to witness a human dissection, but prior to his time, dissection was not a standard clinical practice. What he saw at the dissection, as he writes, was stunning. Let me read off a quote that is on this slide. We found that the body parts and structures, were nothing like those described in the old books, but were exactly as represented in the Dutch book. This book, in English translation, was The Analytical Tables of the Anatomy by Johann Kulmus. Kulmus is spelled Kulmus. We were completely amazed. What he saw at the dissection, as he writes, was stunning. Now, we know that the illustrations in Genpaku's new treatise on anatomy were based more on the illustrations in the source book and less on the actual observations from that day. We now know also that although Genpaku's treatise stimulated new approaches to human anatomy within a Dutch-style medical framework, the Sino-Japanese medical paradigm remained dominant throughout the early modern period, though we find references to new Dutch-style medical insights. On this slide, I have an image from a source, A Guide to Ophthalmology, which was published in 1831. This was a book on Dutch-style medicine. Here's an image. It is a model of human anatomy closer to Genpaku's model than to traditional Sino-Japanese models. And this image hints at how disability might have been understood in light of new theories of vision by those Dutch-style medical scholars. The image right here shows what happens when light enters the eye in far-sighted vision. So the light rays converge right here behind what we now call the retina of the eye. A person with quote-unquote normal vision can see because the light rays converge at the right spot. But someone who is affected by far-sighted vision cannot see clearly because the light rays meet at a spot behind this normal vision. The text or image beyond this description doesn't tell us more, so we can only imagine that vision loss would have been described as a disability if it was significant. Let me talk a little bit about this measles print. For a lot of people, popular medical culture was the interface between medical knowledge and consumer culture. On this slide, we see a print on measles from 1862. At the center, we see two people in conversation with each other, a woman and a man. Now, this is an example of a popular medical print with advice on how to cope with illnesses. To understand the significance of it, we have to think about the popular medical context. Measles is notoriously contagious, and at that time it was feared by many for causing blindness, as was smallpox. And in my book, I introduce the profiles of several people who became blind due to measles and smallpox. The dietary regimen here would have been understood in that light, in terms of how certain foods could interact with the disease poison, the poison of measles and the poison of smallpox, especially the disease poison that wasn't fully eliminated from the body. So I have a summary here of some of the foods that were recommended for recovery and some of the foods to avoid. So some of the foods to eat were daikon, radish, pickles, and kelp. Foods to avoid were burdock root, spinach, and eggplant. Now, we don't know if the remedies actually worked, but instead, I think we should appreciate how these medicines represent popular choices and are objects in the cultural system of cure, beliefs of cure, that rationalize those choices. When we leave out the history of cure, we miss out on this piece of social history. Let me transition into the final part of this presentation to talk about disabled identity. What was disabled identity, and how do we find it in the sources? Let me talk a little bit about this quote for the interpretation of disabled identity. And from early on, I found this quote by Tobin Siebes to be really helpful. Passing, let me read the quote on the screen. Passing as non-disabled and masquerading as more disabled, in addition, sorry, sorry, let me just exit this one more time. I'm having a bit some feedback right here. Great. Passing as non-disabled and masquerading as more disabled, in addition to actions and statements of social critique, are practices where disabled people consistently self-identify as disabled, where they use the knowledge of society unique to them. And this comes from Siba's work, Returning the Social to the Social Model. So what do I mean by this? Oops. And so, in my own words, those blind people in early modern Japan as individuals and in organized groups played a role in scripting and enabling their lives, individually and collectively. They reacted to the conditions of disability as actors who were conscious and cognizant of their circumstances, employing their disabled or disability-based identities to their advantage and also quite often to the detriment of less able peers. I apologize that I have to keep moving out of the shared screen mode because I'm having some distortions in the on the slides that I see before me. So let me talk a little bit about status and identity in early modern Japan. I think the image that is widely associated with Japan is the figure of the samurai, the persona of the samurai. The majority of the Japanese population were, in fact, commoners made up of merchants, artisans, peasants, and townspeople. People had multiple identities and occupations, and local government was organized into status-based rule. So how do we situate blind people in this vibrant context, and how do we give back to them their voice and agency in their everyday lives amid the tensions of discrimination against blind people and against people with disabilities? And how do we capture this social enablement in their lives? Let me focus on the Kyoto Guild of Blind Men. This was founded in the 1200s in Kyoto as an elite academy to train blind men to become musicians of heike. Heike is spelled Heike, the tale of the heike. And these were blind musicians, blind male musicians who performed this genre right through the early modern period. From the late 1600s, the guild had branches all over Japan, and we find references to guild members, blind men, all over the sources. Now, this guild had an exclusively male membership. It had a strict hierarchy. It was an institution that helped blind men with financial means. It was exploitative, but it was also an institution that could represent collective identity and certain privileges. Here I have an image of a blind masseur in 19th century Japan. So this was sometime in the early Meiji period. As you can see right here, this blind person is holding a whistle that looks like a flute. His head is shaven. He is walking with a walking stick right here. He's wearing traditional clogs. And a blind masseur back then would have blown his whistle to announce his arrival, and people would have invited him into their homes and paid him for his massage services. Let me read off a quote, an excerpt of an American's experience of massage in Tokyo. And I'll read off the quote on this slide. It is a warm night in Tokyo. I am very tired, and I've just heard the whistle of a blind shampooer on the streets outside my hotel. A shampooer back then would have referred to a masseur. I have clapped my hands and ordered the shampoo. He now begins to pass his hands over my body. He first seeks out two spots on my shoulders, and into these his thumbs go, it seems to me, almost to the joints. The place he touches are obviously nerve centers, for as he gouges them, my whole frame quivers. Let me talk a little bit more about disability and gender. Now, blind men and women faced discrimination. Being blind was never an easy choice. Whether, how, or when to embrace blind, disabled identity was something that was up to the individual because the choice had consequences on livelihoods and on the person's connections. Blind women had fewer options, and if they worked, they often found acceptance as musicians. We have oral histories of blind female musicians, and in particular, I am thinking about the records of blind female musicians who had some memories of the late early modern period, either because they were born sometime in the early 1800s or because they lived with or were taught by senior musicians who lived through the early 1800s. Let me introduce one fascinating person. Her name is Sugimoto Kikué. Kikué is spelled Kikue, and I will refer to her as Kikué over the next few slides. Kikué was born in 1898. She contracted measles at the age of 5, but she was misdiagnosed. Over time, she lost her sight. And Kikué recalls her mother taking her to different physicians, taking her to temples where she was supposedly able to get cures for her blindness, but she was never cured. At the age of 7, she was adopted by a senior musician, a goze. A goze was a term for a blind female musician. And this senior was named Mase. Mase is spelled M-A-S-E. Her family assumed that music was the only suitable profession for blind girls. And shortly after being adopted by the senior musician, Kikué started traveling. She was trained in lyrical genres by Mase and another senior musician named Katsu. Katsu is spelled K-A-T-S-U. And she went through a rite of passage at the age of 13. She was given a professional name and promoted after about 7 years of training. At the age of 16, she earned the right to accept disciples, but she did not become a senior matriarch or a mother, quote unquote, until after Katsu passed away. And she continued to find physicians for a cure even through her early 20s. I think what's really fascinating here is Kikué's own description of her blindness. And so how blind was Kikué? So in her own words, Kikué says, when it was pitch dark at night, she couldn't see anything and was fearful of walking. On moonlit nights, she could feel light sensations on her eyelids. In the day, she could still make out dim or faint shadows of the sighted guide in front of her. But by the age of 50, she lost all sensations of light and shadows. Now, let me conclude this presentation with some thoughts. This presentation is about blindness and disability. More specifically, it is about disability before disability. So disability before 20th and 21st century concepts of disability. I'm also interested in new directions for disability studies and disability history in US and non-US societies. Where can we find common context? Where can we find points of engagement with each other or with one another? And I'll conclude with this thought about blindness as gain. So I gave a presentation at an online forum, the Critical Blindness Studies Symposium, where presenters talked about blindness as a form of gain. So how do we think about blindness not as disability, but a form of gain, blindness or disability as a new source of identity? How would we do that? What kinds of methods would we approach that? And how would we kind of bring disability studies and disability history into conversation with critical blindness studies? So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Wayne, for that absolutely fascinating discussion. And so next we will have Professor Susan Burns talking about leprosy in early modern Japan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. I want to begin by thanking Dr. Lackney and Professor Schlussel for their role in organizing this event. I want to thank the East Asia National Resource Center at George Washington University, and of course, the funder, the Department of Education. We appreciate the good work you do. And finally, I want to thank my co-panelist, Wayne Tan, who told you a lot about early modern Japan, and that makes it a bit easier for me. On March 31st of 2007, a new national museum opened in Higashimurayama, a suburb of Tokyo. Known as the National Museum of Hansen's disease being an alternative name for leprosy, it stands adjacent to one of Japan's still functioning system of 13 national leprosy sanitaria. The ceremony was presided over by a man named Yanagisawa Hakuo, who was then the Minister of Health, Labor, and Welfare. In its greeting to the assembled audience of journalists, officials, activists, and some former patients, Yanagisawa acknowledged the discrimination that former leprosy sufferers faced within Japanese society long after effective treatments had been developed. He stated that he hoped the new museum would become a core institution in the dissolution of prejudice and discrimination. Yanagisawa's remarks were followed by those of a man named Miyasato Mitsuo, who was the chairman of the National Conference of Sanitarium Residents. Founded in 1951, this organization had played an important role in fighting for the repeal of Japan's 1931 leprosy prevention law. It was this law that gave rise to the national sanitarium system, and it authorized the mass quarantine of Japan's leprosy sufferers. Miyasato used the occasion of the museum's opening to criticize the new museum, stating that, quote, the exhibits are totally inadequate and conceal the shadow of the patient's own testimony. Now, Miyasato was not the only person to express dissatisfaction with the new museum. In the weeks and months that followed, newspapers published critical reviews, and some people took to the new blogosphere to publicize their reactions to the museum, often in a tone of biting contempt. Now, what is significant for my topic today, leprosy in early modern Japan, is that much of the criticism was directed at the very first exhibit, which addressed the history of the disease before modernity. In this period, leprosy sufferers were regarded as part of socially and spatially segregated communities of outcast people. Now, critics of the museum charged that the discussion of the pre-modern history of leprosy was nothing more than an attempt to diminish state responsibility for the discrimination that leprosy sufferers experienced in the modern period. Now, in this regard, it's important to understand that the National Museum came about as a result of a legal settlement between the Japanese government and sanitarium residents. In 1998, a group of former leprosy patients still living in the sanitaria filed suit against the Japanese government, charging that their civil rights had been violated by the long experience of confinement and asking for compensation. In 2001, the court where the case was heard in Kumamoto on the island of Kyushu made its ruling. It found in favor of the plaintiffs and ordered the payment of compensation in the amount of approximately 2 billion yen. Now, the opening of the museum and the debates that accompanied it are suggestive of how politicized the history of leprosy had become by the early 2000s. Now, there was, to be sure, a logic behind the desire to obscure the pre-modern history of leprosy in Japan. The civil rights case made it necessary to identify those responsible for perpetuating the abuses and the apportionment of blame. And ultimately, it was the Japanese state that was found primarily responsible. Now, let me be clear. I don't question the judgment or the fact that leprosy patients suffered greatly under the modern system of quarantine. But as a historian, I think history matters, and unpacking the understanding of the disease and its sufferers that evolved over the pre-modern and early modern periods can help us understand how and why the modern politics of so-called leprosy prevention took form. And here's just a slide of the aftermath of the announcement of the verdict in the civil rights case. And you can see that people were really joyous. So let me begin by talking a bit about the disease that is at the center of my talk today. Leprosy is caused by the Mycobacterium leprae, a bacterium of ancient origin that is believed to have originated in East Africa or Asia. It then spread around the world following the path of human migration and transported within human bodies. The earliest evidence of M. leprae's clinical manifestations comes from a Sanskrit text from the 6th century BCE. In contrast, M. leprae arrived in the Americas only in the 1700s and did not appear in Australasia and Polynesia until after 1800. Now, this Mycobacterium, M. leprae, was first identified in 1873 by a Norwegian scientist, Gerhard Armhauer Hansen, hence the alternative name Hansen's disease. But his discovery did little to settle the issue of leprosy's etiology. M. leprae did not behave according to the newly defined rules of bacteriology. For one, it proved impossible to culture in the laboratory, making it difficult to investigate the path of transmission. Nor was it clear why the incubation period, which could be as long as 20 years, was so prolonged, or why some people became infected while others, even after having lengthy and sustained contact with an infected person, did not. Perplexing, too, was the different ways the disease can progress. Some people develop what became known as lepromatous leprosy, the most disabling and disfiguring form of the disease, which caused damage to joints, bones, internal organs, as well as numerous lesions. Others, however, had a far milder form of the disease, with some people only experiencing pigmented anesthetic patches of skin. As a result, doctors and scientists continued to debate for decades after 1873 whether something other than M. leprae was involved in the process of infection and the progress of the disease. Now, in the last 2 decades, the sequencing of the human genome has provided some answers to these questions. We now know that M. leprae is capable of only limited metabolic activity. It is, in essence, an intercellular parasite that cannot exist outside a host. Scientists now believe that the genetic makeup of the host plays a crucial role in determining both vulnerability to the disease and its subsequent course. Genetic analysis suggests that one group of genes governs susceptibility or resistance to infection, while others control the host immune response. And it's the robustness of the immune response that determines whether the infected person develops a full-blown case of lepromatous leprosy or a milder form of the disease. Now, of course, none of this was known to anyone in the pre-modern period. Instead, physicians, officials, and ordinary people tried to make sense of the disease in light of the disease categories that they had at hand. And here I want to introduce you to the Japanese term lai, or Raibyō, which is the term for leprosy used in Japan, and it derives from the Chinese lai and was introduced to Japan as text and technology from the continent began to flow to the Japanese archipelago in the mid part of the first millennium CE. We find this term lai in some of the earliest Japanese texts, including the 8th century Chronicles of Japan and the 9th century legal commentary, the Ryōgige. But the limited and fragmented textual record that survives from this early period makes it impossible for us to know whether lai renamed a disease category already recognized, propelled a new understanding of a familiar set of symptoms, or described a new disease that was unknown before this time. So this term lai was probably used to describe a larger category of diseases than true leprosy. And we can speculate that skin disorders like scabies, maybe psoriasis, eczema, as well as true lai caused by M. leprae, that these were all sort of understood within the umbrella term of lai. So please keep that in mind. From here on out, I'm going to be talking about leprosy as a translation for the term lai. But it is this pre-modern disease category, this umbrella term that I'm talking about, not leprosy in its modern sense. Now, things come into sharper focus in the period after around 1200 CE, when references to leprosy abound in a variety of different kinds of text, religious, administrative, and legal. A case in point were the records known as kishomon, or pledges. These were utilized to formalize a wide range of agreements, economic and other, as well as to validate claims to truthfulness in relation to criminal acts. And typically, a kishomon, or written pledge, had 2 distinct sections. The first relates the promise to perform some act, or involves a pledge of truthfulness, while the second part of the pledge puts forth the punishment that will result if the signatory breaks his word and doesn't honor the pledge. Now, punishments cited included the wrath of the deities, as well as poverty, death, descent into hell, but most often leprosy, which by the early 14th century had come to be evoked in the majority of written pledges. So I've got one example of such a pledge up here on my slide. It was by a man named Kikuchi Takemochi, who was a warrior, and he was pledging loyalty to the Emperor Go-Daigo. Composed in 1338, this document elaborated on Kikuchi's vow of loyalty to the imperial institution, and it ended with the words, "If I should break this pledge, let me suffer from white leprosy and black leprosy in this life, and be denied the grace of Buddhist law for 7 incarnations." And this is really the classic formulation we see in these medieval pledges. Now, the terms here, white leprosy and black leprosy, come from the text, Buddhist text known as the Lotus Sutra, which was an important object of worship in this period. This particular sutra had an important place within esoteric and monastic forms of Buddhism that date from centuries earlier. But in the 13th century, it was also embraced by new faith-based sects and practice-based sects. Many sutras of Indian origin express the idea that illness results from karmic retribution for bad acts, but the Lotus Sutra advanced a particularly powerful claim. Leprosy was a form of karmic retribution that could occur in this life, offering immediate bodily and therefore visible evidence of the consequences of wrongdoing. Those who read, chanted, or listened to sermons on the Lotus Sutra would have heard several descriptions of the horrors of leprosy, including the one that I have up here. And this particular passage describes the fate of anyone who attacks a faithful Buddhist, and it states that he will have teeth that are missing or spaced far apart, ugly lips, a flat nose, hands and feet that are gnarled or deformed, and eyes that are squinty. His body will have a foul odor with evil sores that run pus and blood. Now, in Japan, this understanding of leprosy as a form of karmic retribution came to intersect with a long existing concern for pollution in the form of bodily fluids, symptoms of sickness, childbirth, and death. Concern for pollution was particularly acute in the city of Kyoto, the imperial capital, and thus a sacred space. Concern for pollution led to the spatial exclusion of the sick and dying, and karmic retribution provided a compelling explanation for why people met this fate. Now, it's important to keep in mind that it is not necessarily the case that all people were excluded. People with mild cases perhaps managed to remain within their homes and live out fairly commonplace lives. But by the early medieval period, we know that there were organized communities of outcast people that included many leprosy sufferers, and these were established at specific sites. In Kyoto, one of the sites where one of these leprosy communities took form was the sloping pathway that led to Kiyomizu Temple. And if you've been to Kyoto, you've probably visited this temple. There was another leprosy community on the ancient road that connected Nara to Kyoto, Nara being the former imperial capital. And my slide actually shows a leprosy sufferer at one of the entrance gates that marks the entrance to the temple area. And you can see the man with some spots on his face and holding the basket, begging for alms. Now, there was an economic logic at work in the formation of the communities in these sites. There were many travelers and pilgrims on these roads, and they would have been a reliable source of alms for the beggars. But there were other reasons for this kind of spatial order as well. The path that followed the incline of the Kiyomizu-zaka, this sloping path, led not only to the temple, but also to the area known as Raibyō, which is over here on my slide. This is an early modern map. And this is one of 3 sites outside the city proper where the dead of the capital were discarded. Now today, Raibyō still exists, and it looks like a typical Japanese cemetery with many closely packed tombs decorated by flowers, cups of sake, and wooden memorial boards. But in the medieval period, it would have presented a very different sight. Then it functioned primarily as a charnel ground, where corpses were often simply discarded to decay, although those of the wealthy might be buried or cremated. The outcast community was located nearby for a reason. When someone died within the city, they were called upon to transfer the corpse to Raibyō, this cemetery area. So this road, Kiyomizuzaka, was, I would argue, a liminal space that lay between the sacred grounds of the temple and the city and the polluted realm of Raibyō. It was then a divide between the world of the dead and the world of the living. Now today, one leprosy hostel that dates from the medieval period still stands. It's located about a 20-minute walk from some of the most heavily touristed areas in Japan, in the ancient capital of Nara. And this is called the Kitayama Hall of 18 Rooms. It is a long, narrow building. You can see it on the right of my slide, that is divided into 8 small windowless rooms. Today, a sign posted just inside the fence that surrounds the building alerts a passerby to its significance. It states that the hall was founded in the 13th century by the monk Ninsho, who established it as a hostel for leprosy sufferers. Now, the hall would continue to serve this function into the 19th century, and the early modern map on the left of my slide shows that the associations with the liminal space between death and life persisted. You can see here the leprosy hostel, looking very much like it does today. But it's situated between a crematoria. This is what this label marks, and a village over here. So we see that it occupies this kind of central space between the ordinary world of the living and, again, the world of the dead. Now, it's important to keep in mind that while medieval hostels like these housed the sufferers of leprosy, they did not seek to isolate them. Instead, leprosy sufferers spilled out into the streets, the roads, and temple grounds. The conception of leprosy as the bad karma disease that I've traced out turned out to be remarkably durable, as did the relegation of many sufferers to begging communities. This arrangement caught the attention of Portuguese missionaries who arrived in Japan in the late 16th century. In the dictionary they compiled and published in Nagasaki, known in translation, I could call it the Japanese-Portuguese dictionary, the term kojiki, a word that later came to mean beggar, is explained as a person with leprosy. So in the mind of these Portuguese missionaries, a beggar was inevitably a person with leprosy. Now, as the new state headed by the Tokugawa shogun took form in the 17th century, leprosy sufferers came to be reconceptualized within the emergent system of early modern status. They were newly understood to be part of a larger status group made up of so-called low people, or senmin in Japanese, a heterogeneous mix of marginalized social groups that constituted one of the major status categories of this period, together with villager, warrior, townsperson, noble, and cleric. Early modern conceptions of status were institutionalized and policed by local, domainal, and shogunal laws and administrative procedures, making status, in the words of historian David Howell, the glue of early modern society, central to both the political order and group and individual identity. Now, as a result of the formation of the early modern status order, segregated communities of leprosy sufferers began to appear around the country. Local historians working in Japan have shown the existence of these communities in a variety of areas, including Hirosaki, now in southwest Aomori Prefecture, Yonezawa, in Yamagata Prefecture, Miharu, Sendai, Aizu. All of these areas are in the Tohoku region, the northern part of Honshu. But there were also some on the islands of Kyushu and Shikoku. And the map that I show on my screen just indicates some of these segregated communities that existed in pre-modern domains. There are probably more, but I'm just drawing from the current scholarship. So taken together, these communities reveal that the equation of leprosy with low status and the spatial segregation of those afflicted became a countrywide phenomenon in the early modern period. Now, in many places, those afflicted with the disease were housed in officially authorized hostels, known by terms such as leper huts and leper houses. I am aware that leper, this term, is a really stigmatizing term, and I'm using it purely as a translation for the Japanese term. Leper huts is laikoya, and leper houses is laiyashiki. In Miharu, for example, there were 4 leprosy hostels in place by the end of the 17th century, and together they housed perhaps 100 people or so. And the situation was similar in the neighboring domains of Aizu and Sendai, although in these domains, the leper huts were established within the castle towns in so-called outcast zones or outcast wards, areas of the town reserved for low-status people. Now, this kind of creation or the organization of urban space by notions of status was very typical in early modern cities and towns. And so the segregation of leprosy sufferers in this way was part of this larger way of thinking about urban space. Now, outside the castle towns, communities of leprosy sufferers were typically organized into villages, what were termed villages. So these were areas, communities that also engaged in cultivation. In Kagoshima and Takanabe on the island of Kyushu, distinctive villages that were associated with leprosy were in place by the early 17th century. And we see a similar arrangement in Kaga domain, where each county seems to have had at least one designated so-called leper village. Now, as David Howell has noted, status in early modern Japan was required to be visible, and so unsurprisingly, many domains had rules governing the appearance of afflicted people. In Miharu, in the early 17th century, sufferers of leprosy were ordered not only to wear a wooden tag engraved with the character he, this was a character that indicated outcast status, but they also were required to shave their heads as a mark of their low status, and they were explicitly forbidden from wearing any kind of head covering that would hide their shaved heads. Now, whether they lived in huts or villages, the organized communities of leprosy sufferers had specific begging rights. In Miharu, for example, where the 4 leper huts were apparently located in close proximity to one another, each hut was assigned specific villages, as many as 40 in one case, where they were allowed to canvass for alms. In addition, specific dates were designated in each month, apparently to ensure that the leprosy sufferers did not come calling too often. In Kaga, begging often occurred in conjunction with celebratory occasions. And in Sendai, yet another domain, lepers, so-called lepers, were allowed to beg at private celebrations and religious observances, events like weddings, funerals, and Buddhist memorial services. Now, as with other forms of status in the early modern period, that of leper, again, I'm using this in quotation marks, carried with it not only specific privileges, but also obligations and duties. which served the larger social interest, but also functioned as a public performance of their low status. In return for their begging rights, sufferers of leprosy were required in many cases to engage in forms of stigmatized work. In Sendai, for example, domainal policy required them to take responsibility for removing the skins from dead horses and other animals that were left at designated animal dumps within the castle town, and they had to dispose of the remains. In other domains, members of these leprosy communities were involved in the disposal of human remains, particularly those of executed criminals and those of indigent travelers who died on the road. In other domains, leprosy sufferers engaged in policing activities, fire watches, and guardhouse duties, burdensome but necessary forms of public service. In spite of their engagement in these kinds of alternative forms of labor, sufferers of leprosy continue to be associated closely with begging. On my slide, I show a image from a work called Illustration of Various Workers, which was printed in 1690. And this work might be best viewed as an attempt to make sense of the new forms of status that emerged under the Tokugawa shogunate and to show the relationship between status and occupation. And so here we see a leprosy sufferer depicted in the act of begging. His face is marked with lesions that signified leprosy in this period, and they both have begging bowls in their hands and baskets on their backs. Now, the process by which those with the disease came to enter the ranks of the low people is far from clear. In his analysis of early modern status, David Howell has argued that as long as a sick or disabled person was cared for within the home, he or she could retain his or her original status identity as a villager, a townsperson, or a warrior. It was only when someone left the home or was forced from the home because their disease was advanced that they were necessarily absorbed into a new status group. As evidence, David Howell points to the famous example of the Guild of the Blind, which Wayne Tan just alluded to in his presentation. I think, however, that the situation of leprosy sufferers was more complicated than Howell's analysis suggests. In Sendai, for example, all of those with leprosy were required to submit to an outcast headman, regardless of their status by birth or whether they were still residing with their families. Now, not every sufferer of leprosy readily accepted his change in status. While Kagoshima and other domains in southwest Kyushu in principle required those with leprosy to relocate to leper villages, not everyone complied. A case from Kagoshima domain is revealing. It involved a warrior official who was in charge of the official tea ceremonies held within the castle. After he developed leprosy, the headman of the local leper village arrived to take possession of him, but he was unwilling to relocate, and he was offered a financial settlement instead. In other words, if he was willing to pay a fee, the headman would have gone away. Conflict emerged, however, when the warrior in question refused to either pay the fee or relocate to the leprosy village, and the headman and other residents of the village attempted to force him to move. Eventually, the headman was reprimanded as unreasonable by domainal officials, but it's unclear what happened to the leprosy sufferer whose condition sparked the controversy. But what's important, I think, here is that the possibility of paying compensation is evidence that the policy of segregation was not necessarily reflective any longer of concerns about karmic retribution. Rather, it indicates a desire to maintain the principle, if not the rule, of the status system. So what I want to look at next is the erosion of the explanation of karmic retribution that resulted over the development of, I think, new forms of medical practice in the early modern period. The period of sustained peace and economic growth that followed the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate saw a tremendous expansion of medical practice, with growing numbers of physicians and a booming market for all manner of medical texts. And medicine became an important part of the new print and reading culture. While self-identified doctors had widely disparate levels of education and expertise and were in competition with a variety of other kinds of healers, from priests to medicine peddlers, they were nonetheless increasingly influential in shaping ideas about sickness and health. By the early 18th century, medical care at the hands of a physician was widely available in major cities, and by the end of that century, doctors had become a feature of life in towns and villages as well. Now, as the number of practicing physicians increased, the scope of the medical expanded as well. Some physicians began to treat illnesses that had been long regarded as divine in origin, and temples and shrines began to sell medical compounds, blurring the line between the medical and the sacred. Unlike medieval physicians who regarded leprosy as untreatable and urged sufferers to engage in religious practices in the hope of expiating their misdeeds, early modern physicians regarded the disease as treatable, although difficult to treat. Writing in the late 18th century, the physician Minami Sono Ishin, who practiced in the area around Sendai, commented that, and I have this quote up on my screen, ordinary people think this disease is punishment from the gods or Buddha or the result of karma, and so they just pay priests to pray over them and do not seek treatment. And thinking their disease is fatal, they just wait for death. There is nothing more ridiculous than this. Leprosy is just one disease among many. Writing a few decades later, the physician Okamura Wajun, who practiced in Sasayama in what is now Hyogo Prefecture, openly mocked the theory of heavenly retribution, which he attributed to those he called Confucianists. He noted that while the city of Osaka had few sufferers, the disease was known to be prevalent in some villages. Should one conclude then that the villages were filled with evildoers and those in the cities were all sages who followed the will of heaven? Physicians who rejected the idea of divine retribution also took note of the impact it had upon those who were afflicted. For example, the physician Tatebe Yudo wrote, "Because people think this is heaven's punishment, they reject those who are sick and make no effort to treat them." While a growing number of physicians rejected the explanation of divine retribution, there was considerable disagreement over what did then cause the disease. Some accepted the orthodox understanding in Chinese medicine, which held that leprosy was the result of wind, that is, climactic factors that cause disharmony in the human body. This was the position taken by a doctor named Ashikawa Keishu, who published a medical reference book called Explaining the Names of Diseases. Ashikawa referenced a work by a Chinese physician named Li Chan to offer up this theory of the disease. Leprosy erupted when wind entered the body of someone who was already suffering from heat poison. And this heat poison was understood to be the result of overexertion during sex or too much rich food and drink. As a result, according to this theory, blood was adversely affected, and the patient developed lesions, swelling of the extremities, and patches of white skin. As the disease progressed, the symptoms worsened. The voice became hoarse, eyebrows disappeared, flesh rotted from the hands and feet, and the nose collapsed. Now, while many physicians continued to use the term wind, the concept was subject to considerable revision as doctors attempted to account for the fact that the disease seemed to be common in some locales and rare in others. And interestingly, this pattern would be borne out when the first national survey of prevalence was conducted in the late 19th century. Sorry to disappear for a moment. I just realized my computer was about to die. Okamura Wajun, another physician, was one of many who pondered the weird distribution of the disease, and he concluded that it was environmental in nature and used the term as the idea that cases of leprosy were associated with specific places gained adherence. Many physicians began to view it as the result of bad
Hi, Susan. You're muted right now.
Sorry, I'm having a few technical difficulties. Here we go. Okay, I think we're back. We have these various ideas about the relationship between environment and the disease emerge. But then from the second half of the 18th century, the theory that leprosy was the result of some kind of exterior cause began to be challenged by physicians who argued that it was wholly or primarily self-produced, a theory that would be popular well into the 19th century, and which again linked the disease to concerns about morality. The concept of self-production became increasingly popular as physicians and ordinary people embraced the concept of health cultivation. This was the idea that the prevention of disease was primarily the responsible of each individual, who by monitoring and regulating his or her body could avoid illness and achieve a long life. The return of morality is apparent in the many discussions of diet and the self-production of leprosy. While some Chinese physicians had argued that sufferers of wind diseases should avoid certain foods, the theory that specific foods caused or were a contributing factor to leprosy loomed large in many Japanese discussions of the disease. So when we look at these medical texts, we see these long lists of foods that should be avoided. The other thing that was believed to result in the self-production of the disease was sex and sexual desire. The notion that sexual indulgence either rendered one susceptible to leprosy or hindered recovery was widely shared. In a work published in 1819, the Kyoto physician Arimochi Keiri argued that recovery from leprosy was possible only if the patient was wholly abstinent. Honma Soken, a famous Edo physician, took the prescription one step further, writing that the mere stirring of sexual desire, even when not acted upon, could compromise any effort at treatment. In the 1780s, the physician Murai Kinzan, a domainal doctor on the island of Kyushu, compiled a compendium of medical recipes that he called 10,000 Japanese formulas. And it so impressed his lord, the Lord of Kumamoto, that he had it published and presented to the shogun. An entire chapter of this work is devoted to leprosy, but it doesn't contain a single formula for a treatment. This makes sense, however, in light of Murai's stated view that treatment could not cure leprosy, which he called the most terrible disease. Rather than treatment, Murai's concern was prevention. He wanted to set off the alarm that this dreaded disease was becoming increasingly common, and that it had a specific cause. In his view, sexual morality had declined to such a degree that men and women were engaging in sexual intercourse, even while the woman was menstruating, an act that Murai contemplated with disgust. Describing menstrual blood as polluted and putrefied, he argued that when a child is conceived during such an act, which of course is highly unlikely, the bad menstrual blood would be incorporated into the developing fetus, and at some point, the child would erupt into a full-blown case of leprosy. So Mulai's discussion is indicative of an important new element of the medical discussion of leprosy. In the last decades of the 18th century, a growing chorus of voices emerged that suggested it was blood that caused leprosy and blood that transmitted it. Although doctors writing this period offered different theories about the causal factors in play, they were united in their understanding that the process that produced this, they were united in their understanding of the process that produced the symptoms of the disease. Whether because of wind, bad food, miasma, too much sex, or some combination of these factors, blood became unnaturally and pathologically hot. A rich and illuminating vocabulary was deployed to explain the effects of heat on blood. The hot blood congealed, it putrefied, it fermented, it stagnated, it became dirty, poisoned, or polluted. Now, it goes without saying that the blood of which these Japanese doctors wrote differed from the substance as it is understood in modern biomedicine. Blood was the material manifestation of qi, this energy force that gives rise to matter. And so we see terms like blood qi. In a healthy person, qi, blood, and blood qi were supposed to move spontaneously and unopposed around the body from one organ to another. But in contrast to this ideal of fluid motion, the hot blood that caused leprosy was imagined to be turgid and slow moving. As blood became the focus of medical discussions of leprosy, so too did the female body. Within the Chinese medical tradition, blood was specifically associated with the reproductive processes of the female body, and physicians offered various theories about how the female body was involved in the development of leprosy. The famous physician Katakura Kakuryō argued that leprosy had multiple causes. but he suggested that the bloody discharge that followed childbirth was one important cause. Blood that was not quickly expelled would stagnate within the woman's body, where it would turn poisonous and cause the symptoms of leprosy. And then once the woman had leprosy, she could pass it through to her children. While no physicians explicitly rejected the idea that transmission could take place from an infected father, they obsessed over the danger posed by the maternal body, because it was assumed that the child came into contact with the mother's blood while in the womb, during childbirth, and even after birth, since breast milk was understood to be a form of maternal blood. Now, doctors in this period did not, in fact, could not distinguish between congenital infection and hereditary transmission, and their language reflected this. So we see up here on my slide the various terms that were used to describe this transmission of bad blood from mother to child, and they include, if you know Japanese terms like densen, idoku, iden, and then we find these new terms for leprosy, idoku no yomai, ketsumyaku no yomai, and these all refer to diseases of the lineage or diseases of the family line. Some doctors suggested that leprosy could be latent for 1 or 2 generations, only to appear unexpectedly, and others believed that bad blood, once formed, actually grew stronger as it was passed from one generation to another. By the end of the 18th century, the idea of leprosy as a bad blood disease that could be transmitted within a lineage was the new orthodoxy. And physicians writing on the disease were quick to warn of the danger it posed to families. And I have up here a quote from Katakura Kakuryō, this famous Edo doctor, but I won't read it since it was a bit lengthy. But it basically warns people to be very careful in their choice of marriage partners. And he advised people to avoid marriage with what he called a leprous lineage, even if it was otherwise advantageous. And we see this kind of warning in many, many medical texts of the period. I think I'm going to skip the next section, which I talk a little bit about treatment, and move to my conclusion. Over the course of the early modern period, the medicalization of leprosy did not replace the longstanding concept of karmic retribution. Instead, it overlaid it with a new set of concerns about sexual desire, diet, and place, about individual behavior and its effects on the family and social order. This new secular medical discourse did not then lessen the stigma of the disease. Indeed, the idea of bad blood extended the stigma of the disease even to uninfected people in a family where the disease occurred. While some physicians expressed sympathy for sufferers, in some cases castigating the ignorance of both their fellow physicians and ordinary people who accepted the idea of karmic retribution, many others emphasized the danger that those afflicted with leprosy posed to their possible children and through them to their lineage as a whole. The new concern for transmission through the blood made it possible for physicians to affirm the exclusion of leprosy sufferers on medical grounds. Indeed, for physicians like Katakura, the forms of exclusion of leprosy sufferers practiced in many areas of Japan made perfect sense. He wrote approvingly of the situation in such places where, he wrote, those who have leprosy live in a leper village and marry only within those villages. Now, in my introduction, I noted that much of the reportage on leprosy in recent years purposefully ignores the long and complex history of the disease in the pre-modern and early modern periods. In my book, Kingdom of the Sick, I argue that this history would continue to mediate efforts to control the disease over the course of the 20th century. When the Japanese parliament first debated the need to establish sanitaria around the turn of the century, some politicians protested that they were unnecessary, given that leprosy was a hereditary disease, not an infectious one. This was even though Hansen's discovery was well known at the time. Missionaries in Japan, both Protestant and Catholic, too, seem to have embraced this view of the disease, with some calling on a ban on marriage of leprosy sufferers, and others calling for the forced isolation of sufferers by gender. Even Japanese officials who embraced the idea that leprosy was an infectious disease argued, in many cases, against an institutional response, characterizing the creation of sanitaria as both costly and inhumane. Evoking the so-called leper villages discussed by early modern doctors, they argued that allowing leprosy sufferers to live and work in segregated villages was a kinder response than putting people in institutions, and one that was authorized by Japanese tradition. Now, the intertwined juridical imperatives of determining responsibility and calculating reparations that ordered the civil rights suits has had sought, I think, to obscure this history. And this might be regarded as fair, even just, and necessary by many. But I would like to argue that as leprosy recedes from lived experience and even from memory, learning from this history is more important than ever before, as we continue to grapple with the question of the place of the sick, the disabled, and the biologically vulnerable in Japanese society and in our own, of course. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those absolutely fascinating talks. I would like to actually circle back to something Wayne said at the beginning of his talk, namely, what questions do we want to ask of our sources, and about what questions should we ask? So please, if you do have questions, you can either raise your hand and we will call on you if you're comfortable speaking in the Zoom, or else you can type them in the chat and I will be more than happy to read your questions for you. Yes.
Well, if I may ask a very naive question, first of all, thank you both so much for these talks. The empirical richness is wonderful. I just been talking to my grad students about the early modern, so this is flowing beautifully from our seminar discussion. I want to know a little bit more about the encounter of these conceptualizations of disease sort of with the modern. I'm a China historian, so looking about like Ruth Rogoski's recent work, or some of her older work for that matter, Sakura Christmas's work, I think a lot about how sort of Japanese modern science is applied as a technology of politics in the Japanese Empire in China. And I'm wondering, like, what are the remnants of these conceptualizations of blindness or leprosy that we might see elsewhere in the Japanese Empire? Do they survive, or are they simply overwhelmed by the modern?
Wayne, do you want to go first?
Sure, of course. So this is Wayne Tan speaking. Thank you very much, Dr. Schlusel. Thank you for the questions about disease and illness and conceptualization. I think this question really speaks to the heart of what historians do, how we think about modern concepts and either project those concepts onto the past or find ways to tweak those concepts based on the knowledge of the past that we study. So maybe I could speak a little bit more about social practices of blind people. From historical records, I think and also from evidence from the 19th century and the 20th century, and even today, I think a profession like massage and a profession like acupuncture is still considered to be a profession for visually impaired people. And during the period of empire, I think we find evidence of blind masseurs and blind acupuncturists in places like Taiwan, in China. So I don't know. I mean, it's something that I'm interested in if there's a direct connection between the history of blind professions in early modern Japan and these later practices, social practices in the Japanese Empire. And I think the point about public health, I mean, that's really interesting as well. I'm glad that you referenced Professor Ruth Rogoski and her excellent work on public health in China. Now, the word for public health, I think the common conception here is that early modern Japan didn't have modern public health and perhaps didn't have public health at all. But this is all relative, of course, and how we define public health. In terms of health, healthcare, I think as Professor Burns mentioned, there was a lot of emphasis on health cultivation, yojo, the cultivation of health for oneself. And I think we see these practices, references to self-cultivation, health cultivation, even after the early modern period. Um, and I would just add one more thought also about concepts of disease and illness and how that relates to disability. I think for a lot of disability historians, this is probably a contentious point, but also a potential point of engagement with the history of medicine. How we define disease and how we use definitions of disease to look back on definitions of a disability. So the words for disability in early modern Japan revolved around words for disease and illness, ill health, quote unquote, sickly bodies. And I think throughout the period of the Japanese Empire, we find that there was still no clear standardization of a word like disability. But there were still definitions for disability as forms of disease and illness.
Yeah, I would say that, in we sometimes have this sense that if there is a breakthrough, like we identify lepra, that everything changes. But I think one of the things that the story of leprosy in Japan suggests is that um, existing disease categories have a lot of weight, and often they reflect, experiential knowledge, right? So, the fact that these doctors concluded, the early modern doctors, that leprosy was transmitted. They don't have an understanding of genetics, but they did recognize that there was this pattern of intrafamilial infection, and they recognized that you didn't catch it with casual contact. And so in the late 19th century, when there's this sort of international concern about leprosy, based upon migration and imperial expansion and coming into contact with leprosy in new populations, there was this idea that it's like cholera, you can catch it easily, or measles or smallpox. But people in Japan knew, right, that wasn't the case. And so we can see a kind of clash in the late 19th and early 20th century, but between this kind of body of experiential knowledge, which suggested it's actually not easy to catch leprosy, and the new kind of public health knowledge. And so I think it's interesting in that way to think about when and how a new understanding of disease catches on. And in the Japan case in the modern period, in order to um, legitimize the decision to quarantine people, they continually, in sort of public health messaging to the populace, stress how infectious leprosy is, really exaggerating how easy it is to catch. And I think that is where culpability of the state rest, right? That they do have a counterbody of knowledge, and yet they choose, in fact, to insist upon, that you're constantly in danger of catching it if you have any kind of casual contact with a person with the disease. even though there's generations of knowledge suggesting that just was not the case. And, in relation to your question about the empire, they really import, or I should say export, this kind of modern system of mass incarceration of leprosy sufferers to the colonies, to both Taiwan and to Korea, and exacerbating the stigma of the disease in the same way that it happened in the metropole.
It's fascinating. Thank you very much. Let's open the floor a bit. I see a number of actual Japan experts in the room.
This is where I tell my
Okay.
students, every question is a good question.
So in that case, I have maybe a brief follow-up question for Wayne. So one thing Susan mentioned in her talk is that there's these sort of two polarities of causality, right? This sort of idea that negative karma is responsible for causing leprosy, but also this kind of idea that maybe you can prevent it from positive health self-cultivation. Was there like a sort of similarly negative interpretation for the origins of blindness in Japan?
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Lackney. Thanks for that question. So if we look at the medieval period before the early modern period, I think that there were certainly ideas of blindness as karmic retribution, as punishments for sins. And a lot of these ideas were tied to the Buddhist worldview. And I do want to say that I don't think this idea completely went away during the early modern period. But the status system under the Tokugawa shogunate, I think, really institutionalized the statuses of blind people. And going back to what Dr. Burns said about the polarity, the interlayers or overlays of knowledge, I think the status system kind of provided a framework for rethinking and also reorganizing the identities of blind people. I think it's really hard to tell if every everyday person back then believed in ideas of blindness as karmic retribution, as people in the medieval period would have done so. But I think the status system really gave a new basis for the organizations of livelihoods of blind people. And then I think there's also this missing piece of the individual choice. We have really stark ideas of blindness and sight today. And I think there's still a stereotype that people who are blind are completely blind or completely visually impaired. But I think that sight and blindness are on a spectrum. People with blindness, as going back to the example of Sugimoto Kikué, could still sense light. They could still have some residual vision from childhood. And in certain situations, it was advantageous for a person with visual impairment to assert their blindness as part of their identities. But in other situations, it was less advantageous to do so. And so I think this, the missing piece here is the individual agency, the role of each person in making those choices. And I think that is, that kind of complicates this picture of, blindness as karmic retribution, blindness as status, because I think we have to figure out also the role of individual decisions in embracing blindness as an identity.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate how I think you've really throughout your talk kind of emphasized the agency of the individual within these systems. So we have a question from the chat saying, could you please talk a bit more about the concept of pollution and stigma? I guess that is for either of you to answer.
Yeah, I guess I can tackle that. So, if you read the very early Japanese text, the Kojiki, the Nihon Shoki, you find descriptions of concern about pollution. So it's an idea that has a very, very old history in Japan. And of course, we see it in many early societies, this concern about coming into contact with um, the remains of dead humans or animals, as well as just bodily fluids writ large. So that idea of pollution predates concern about karma, right? It's earlier than the introduction of Buddhism to Japan. But I think what we see happening, particularly in the imperial city of Kyoto, is that they come to be merged in really interesting ways. And so, um, you know, uh, leprosy is, people are concerned that it is a source of pollution. It's also understood as being the result of retribution for misdeeds, but those misdeeds can also be not only moral misdeeds, but also, not performing the purification rites once you've had contact with pollution. So there's a way in which pollution and, moral misdeeds come to be linked together. And there's also this interesting idea in medieval Japan that people who are in a polluted state are also the people best equipped to deal with pollution. They're the ones who can clean it up without any further harm. And I think that's why we see leprosy sufferers, for example, at Kiyomizu, being the ones that are dealing with the dead. They are already in this liminal state between life and death because of their illness, and therefore they're given the task of handling the dead. I hope that explains it. It's a fairly complicated concept.
Thank you so much for that. We have another question in the chat. This is for Dr. Burns. Could you please talk a bit about your Mapping Medical Tokyo project and perhaps say how that suggests more directions for students interested in using mapping as part of their dissertation projects?
That's a great question. I'm actually finishing up my final revisions to that book manuscript, so it's on my mind. But I actually got interested in mapping in relation to this leprosy project, and I've touched upon how the problem of space figures. And when I was working on the modern chapter, I became aware that there were all of these, before the state sanctioned quarantine of leprosy sufferers got underway with the passage of a law in 1907, there were lots of commercial hospitals that were caring for leprosy sufferers, some in the city of Tokyo, and I was interested where these were. So that is when I, began learning how to map, first using the commercial software called ArcGIS, because I wanted to understand where these things were placed. And what I discovered, of course, is that they were placed in the most populated neighborhoods of Tokyo at the time. And it shows you, I think, that at that moment, people weren't concerned about coming into contact with people because, they recognize that it's difficult to catch leprosy unless you're got what we now know, the genetic makeup, or we're profoundly immunocompromised. You don't catch it via casual contact. And so there's this interesting moment when leprosy hospitals, treatment facilities were in the heart of the city. And then later, of course, as this sort of new medical knowledge about leprosy is introduced, and it's an infectious disease caused by a mycobacterium, the first public sanitary were all in quite remote places. And there was a great deal of concern about having one in the midst of one's community. So I think, to sort of get back to the gist of your question, that mapping is really helpful, and that as historians, we're quite attentive, I think, to time and change over time. But very often we don't treat space seriously enough. What I like about mapping is that it provides a really powerful way to look at the way in which spaces are utilized in different ways at times. We can see connections between things like property values or population or topography and where institutions are established. So I really recommend it to historians who are working on medicine and public health, but other issues as well. There's a bit of a learning curve with the software, but if I, at age late, I think I was in my late 50s when I began to learn, if I can do it, someone who didn't get their first computer until they were almost 30, I'm sure that the next generation of scholars can do it. So I urge all of you to experiment with mapping. It's really interesting and you learn new things.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that concludes our time for the day, and I think that's actually a fantastic note to end on, that, we can all still keep learning and finding new ways to, enhance our knowledge of these understudied historical topics. So once again, I'd like to thank Professor Wayne Tan and Professor Susan Burns for joining us tonight, and hope to see everyone at future NRC events. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.